Morning, everybody. Good morning to our virtual audience as well. We're really pleased today to have, we did a little switcheroo to get more people in person in the class. So we're moving the Indigenous Energy Justice course to March when Maggie Talmadge can join us in person. But today we're pleased to have Joe Kresge from Joe Evans from the Kresge Foundation. He's a social investment and portfolio manager for the Kresge Foundation and is really one of the most grounded people in the field working on how to make sure big things like the IRA actually benefit communities directly and solving some of the investment conundrums that we face in this new era. So we're really excited to have him here today. He's going to speak for a little bit, then we'll go to some quick Q&A. Online audience members, please put them in the chat or the Q&A portion, and we'll bring your questions up. And with that, I'm pleased to introduce Joe Evans. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Julie, how do I advance the keyboard? Great. So yeah, I'm Joe Evans. I work for the Kresge Foundation. It's a $4 billion private foundation centered in Metro Detroit. Our tagline, our high-level kind of mission is expanding equity and opportunity in America's cities. Almost everything we do is in the U.S. We have a program in education in South Africa as kind of an outlier. We were founded by this man, Sebastian Kresge. He he was like in the early 1900s. His big innovation was you used to go into stores and you would walk up to the counter and there'd be a clerk and all the products would be behind them. And you would tell them what you want and they'd go up and down the aisles and get everything for you. The innovation was to like let people walk around the store and browse. So he and the couple other retailers of his era kind of invented browsing. And well, a different kind, so browsing for products. Expanded really quickly, went national in a matter of 4 or 5 years, and he endowed in about I think 1920 or 1924. It's our 100th anniversary this year. He endowed the Kresge Foundation. For about 80 years, Kresge did only capital matching grants. So some of you may have been at other schools where there was a Kresge auditorium or a Kresge court or a Kresge clinic. For until about the mid 90s, they made matching grants for capital campaigns at universities, other public institutions. About that time in the mid 90s, we hired our current CEO, and he started to shift us to looking for a time. He started to shift us to a more strategic philanthropy approach with defined program areas. Working in we're kind of half a place-based funder and half a national funder. There are 7 program areas, and the team I'm on, this social investment practice. Our home city is Detroit, and we spend maybe 20% of our budget there. We helped Detroit through a bankruptcy. We're instrumental in saving the amazing art collection, the Detroit Institute of Arts, solidifying city employee pensions, and through that work, we also did a lot of work to revitalize the waterfront at a river that runs right between Detroit and Toronto, and it was kind of a dumping ground for many years and fenced off, and we engaged in a huge project to revitalize that, make it a big public asset, jogging trails and bike trails and parks and stuff. And so then we started going around the country to find, we learned a lot helping Detroit through its bankruptcy. There must be other post-industrial cities in the US that could benefit from our knowledge and our experience. And we hit on Fresno, Memphis, and New Orleans. And what some of those things, each of those cities share is a post-industrial kind of reality, underused large public assets, and some other similarities with the challenges that we were facing. That's the American Cities practice. The other practices listed here, essentially everyone at Kresge works in community development. We all approach that work through our different lenses. The team I'm on is a social investment practice. We get a very tiny grant budget. We're pretty much not grant makers, but someone on my team is assigned with each of the grant making teams to help them identify capital barriers in their program strategy. So the environment team wants to ensure that communities of color and low-income communities can fully participate in the transition to a cleaner, greener, healthier future. There are capital barriers to making that happen. And so that's where someone from my team would pair with them to identify the barriers and try to make investments against them. mostly usually to try to like pave the way, to demonstrate what can be done, to often demonstrate a business opportunity to the markets that aren't seeing it or believe the risk is higher than it is. I just said this, so this screw. I'm preaching to the choir here, I think, a little bit. Don't have to tell you folks that communities of color and low-income communities are, bear the brunt of the things that are causing climate change, the effects of climate change, and as more affluent America moves away from reliance on fossil fuels in the grid, these same communities end up holding the bag on that legacy infrastructure. Your professor was just telling me that what did you say, 65% or the 65% of the cost of fueling appliances with fossil fuels is the transmission. Well, as more and more people move away, more and more people of means move away from that reliance and get induction stoves and EV charging stations and electrify their homes, they become less reliant on that infrastructure, but the cost, the gross cost remains the same. And so the people who are left reliant on the grid will face more and more of the costs of the legacy infrastructure to maintain it. I wanted to, I don't know if these will be helpful, but I'm kind of new to the environment space, maybe only as involved as long or less than some of you. I started partnering with the team maybe 3-4 years ago. I spent my career helping foundations use the tools of investment to achieve their programmatic strategies. So it's kind of a generalist across all program areas. I found myself getting very confused about kilowatts and the sizes of systems and energy versus power. So just as a kind of frame of reference, like a smaller house, home, a 5 kilowatt system is about the size that you would expect on a smaller, modest size house. When you're thinking about a community center, now you're talking about like a 100 kilowatt system. As a sort of average size for a community serving building, a smaller commercial installation. And then when you're talking about a larger community solar systems, that's when you talk about like a megawatt system. And now the world I live in is tiny compared to the corporate energy solar space. When we talk about trying to, how do we bring in corporations into this work? How do we tap their balance sheets, their resources, their expertise? Well, when we draw a cutoff of what we think are like large commercial systems and smaller systems, that cutoff is like 5 megawatts. But then if I try to talk to the people in the communities of color and the organizations who are trying to serve these same communities, 5 megawatts is a massive system. I mean, there's no system outside of like, I don't know, there are some, but like you have to be looking at like utility scale or just, virtual power plants and massive systems in the community development space to get to that level. So just that there is this gulf between what corporate America thinks solves the problems and the projects that they want to focus on and the amount of capital they're willing to put in chunks and what the community can deliver in terms of projects that are real, projects that can be packaged up together to get to a level where corporate America will pay attention or make their balance sheets available. We have to aggregate a lot of projects to get anywhere near what is expected there. Even in the threshold, if like up to 5 megawatt, they want to see 2 and 3 and 4 megawatt systems, not my health center with a 100 kilowatt system on it. So I don't know if that's helpful. It's kind of, there'll be a couple of side ventures. Here's I think I wanted this one first. So another thing that confused me is like, the generation and ability to create power and the capacity versus energy and the use of it and how much you draw. So I don't know, this might be too basic for some of you folks, but that's an incandescent light bulb at 100 watts, but how much does it draw? I understand now that when people talk about the draw, they talk about per hour. So that stove running at a normal temperature, cooking dinner is going to draw 2 kilowatts an hour. But then when people talk about generation, they mean the power over time. And these are, simple concepts. But for me, it took me a while to sort of get them to sink in. We talk about capital stacks a lot in the work that I do. How do you finance a project? How do you pay for a project? Oh, I meant to bring my someone asked a good question about, like, is there a way to get a nonprofit to have a project without an equity contribution from them? The simple answer is yes, lots of ways. My advice is they shouldn't own it. They should lease it or enter a power purchase agreement, but I'll talk more about that. But this would be a capital stack where from the viewpoint of the owner of a system. And so if this was a nonprofit, they would have to come up with the required grant or equity. If it was a asset owning company that was entering lease agreements with lots of nonprofits, they would have to come up with that equity. And then the investment tax credit. Folks are familiar with the investment tax credit? Generally, no. So there's a federal investment tax credit, the solar investment tax credit, that will provides 30% of the cost of solar and storage and some related charges as a tax credit. When the federal government seeks to solve a problem, a social problem, they always kind of default to a market approach. And in a lot of ways that makes sense. It's a capitalist country. Greed has been a great driving force for a lot of innovation. And our system of government and support of market change usually reflects that. So we don't have enough affordable housing. We created the low-income housing tax credits. We want to spur new development in low-income communities. We created the new markets tax credits. And some level, these programs suck in a lot of ways. They deliver benefits to. If your goal was solely to improve lives of lower income people, you wouldn't have come up with those programs. But if your mechanism of doing it was by marshaling market actors and their drive for profit, that's how we end up with these programs. And in some ways, they've been tremendous boons. New Haven has seen plenty of investment from low-income housing tax credits, new markets tax credits. In the solar space, they came up with the solar investment tax credit. And if you install a system, what happens, like with this program, it doesn't have to be low-income benefit. It is for all solar systems. You install the system, you turn it on, you get the tax credit benefits, you can get it immediately. It has to stay operational for 5 years. And folks are familiar with the Inflation Reduction Act, passage of that maybe a year and a half or so ago. So this credit was, the investment tax credit was cycling down. It was reducing every year from 30% into the 20s and was set to expire. The Inflation Reduction Act reset it at 30%, extended its use another 8 or 10 years. And importantly, for my work and this work, it offered 2 new ways to monetize the credit. Initially, the only way you could monetize the credit is the owner of the system that generated the credit had to have a tax liability greater than the credit. It was if you've ever done your own taxes, it was a credit. It wasn't a deduction. And it wasn't refundable. This made it difficult to use in low-income communities. We had to come up with these very complex, which I think I got some maps of, skipping ahead a little bit, very complex structures to be able to monetize the credit, where you had to bring in a separate tax equity investor who would have the tax liability, would get the credit. The IRA has changed this so that you can now sell the credit, which works like other tax credit programs, or you can, if you're a nonprofit, you can get it refunded on your tax return. And I'll stop there. I'll get out of that rabbit hole. The gap cost here, so you get some amount of equity, you get the investment tax credit. That says 40% because there are adders to the credit if you're in an energy justice community, if you buy domestic content, there's different ways to get a credit above 30%. And then there's this gap cost, and that is financed through debt. And that debt tends to come from the community development finance system. A few terms you may be familiar with. Off-taker is, when we say off-taker, we mean the person or company or entity that's using the power that a system generates. A power purchase agreement is a contract through which you basically, your roof or your field, you sort of lease it to an entity that sits a solar system on it, and then you sign an agreement to buy the power from it. The owner of the system takes on the operations and maintenance. A lot of folks net metering is where community solar Community solar works by you have a solar system on your roof, you send it to the utility, they give you credits. You give those credits to your subscribers. So community solar system is basically shared. People share the power generated from a central system. They don't get that power directly. It just goes on the grid. You pull your energy from the grid and you get some kind of credit on your bill or other ways. Interconnection, this is just basically it's the connection of your solar array to the grid. This is in some states, this is like 8 months and tens of thousands of dollars. In other places, it's like a call to your building inspector. So varies greatly around the country in terms of the level of challenge of connecting your system to a grid. So in the work that I've been doing with our environment team, this is sort of our North Star, is that low-income communities, communities of color have equitable access to this transition that we're all in the midst in, and that capital is not the challenge to making that happen. Philanthropy, understand, one of my silent charges in talking to you today is we need smart people in this space. We need more of you, and there's lots of places to plug in and work. Philanthropy is a great place. It can be an exciting place to work. It can be a depressing place to work. What makes it depressing at times is how little you really can do. Well, we can, Kresge has $4 billion. That means we give about $200 million out a year. That sounds like a lot of money to me, anyway, in a vacuum. But you look at just last quarter, some of the handful of the largest banks in the country, they dwarf our entire endowment in just their net profits for 3 months. Their monthly net income at the largest banks is more than our entire endowment. So the only way to see real change in the country is to bring in the people with all of the resources. And the way philanthropy can do that is by, folks at JP Morgan are like, well, we can't invest in a low-income community. They don't pay their bills. And so philanthropy says, well, look, we'll do this project for any kind of lending, mortgage or energy or whatever the topic is that they're sort of deemed too risky, and demonstrate that, hey, their default rates are lower, they're et cetera, with the microgrids. In some ways, it's an easy case to make because in a lot of the places you put the grid up and your expenses go down. So it ends up being the first bill anybody pays, because if they don't pay it, their expenses go up. The other problem for the banks tends to be scale. Like we said before, how many 5 kilowatt systems do we have to get on houses in New Hallville to be able to get a loan from JP Morgan to do it? 2,000. There's a big gulf between the scale they're looking for and what philanthropy can deliver, or what the community development space can deliver. Most of the funders at Kresge are community development funders. They support organizing, advocacy, cross-sector tables, the large, planning efforts. But to realize those plans takes capital. And there is an entire system out there, the community development finance system, made up of mostly the direct lenders they are unregulated loan funds. Are folks familiar with community development finance institutions? No, so there's an entire field. There's 1,000 of these organizations around the country. They are not regulated by the FDIC or the comptroller or any other federal entity. There's a Department of Treasury called the CDFI Fund, which was created under Bill Clinton, and certifies organizations that meet certain standards to be a community development finance institution. Some of the larger names, maybe some of you heard LISC, Capital Impact, Low Income Investment Fund. There's an entire sector that exists to finance projects, businesses, and people where banks will not go. And some of them can be, a few of them are depositories. Most of the depositories that work in this space are credit unions. There are a few minority banks who also have qualified as CDFIs. They tend to be the first lenders in these communities where we're trying to work. The challenge with this, folks have heard of the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. I know you had someone speaking about that. $27 billion under the IRA that's essentially aimed at the community development finance system. will be distributed through the community development finance system. The problem is that community development finance institutions have been very slow to come into climate finance. We spent a few years, so our typical playbook when working with our program teams are we've identified the capital barrier. People in low-income communities can't get their energy or energy efficiency or EV charging projects financed. Okay, so we'll make sure that community development finance institutions and green banks, that capital isn't their barrier. We'll make capital available to them and tell them we want projects in low-income communities. And we did that for 2 or 3 years, and we found that that money wasn't really moving. When we would ask them why, they would say, oh, those projects are too hard, they don't pencil out, the groups aren't ready. When we would go and talk to environmental justice or community serving organizations and ask them, hey, why isn't your project advancing? They'd be like, well, we love that CDFI that you connected us with, or we love our local green bank, but we want to, this is complicated stuff. We want to understand it for ourselves. They tell us we have to put equity in. We've got a little bit of money, but a long list of priorities. I heard a number of times, I tapped my deputy to go out and get up to speed on this stuff, maybe to take one of your courses. But then that's not their top priority, or they're spending time doing it. So what we found was the barrier wasn't really the access to capital. Because then if you could find a project that was ready to be financed, then there would be green banks and CDFIs who would send term sheets over. But the problem was getting those projects ready. In the black around this, well, maybe I should have spent a moment on this. I think you can read it from there. But when we think about the community development finance ecosystem, these different types of organizations, all of which need smart people who care about communities, are actors in the space. The CDFIs and the green banks are the direct lenders. The governments create incentive programs, enabling legislation, all sorts of grant money available at times, early customers, investors and social investors. So social investors are foundations, sometimes family offices, sometimes insurance companies or banks that set up a separate community development division within themselves. And they're sort of frontline investors. Kresge does a lot. We do a lot of like de-risking other investors. So, hey, Citibank will put in $1 million of first loss. If things go bad, you lose our money first. If you put in 5 million behind it or 10 million behind it. They put the community groups in the center. Those would be, in this example, the entities looking for their climate finance projects, their renewable energy, their energy efficiency. And then the helpers and co-developers, I did this last year. If I were doing this today, I'd split that into 2 groups. Because what we have are, as I was saying before, we sort of realized that access to financing wasn't the problem. So we started to identify organizations that were working directly with community groups to try to help them realize their projects, and then make sure they had the capital that they needed. When I said I would split it into 2 groups, I would split them between the helpers and the developers. So there's an entire ecosystem of technical assistance providers in the country. Groups like Solar United Neighbors, Grid Alternatives, Elevate, Groundswell. And what we have, and then the developers, there are a lot of like kind of shoestring operations, or people are not, they didn't come to this as a solar professional. They saw a problem in their community or with a certain type of organization, and they want to help ensure that those organizations can realize their projects. And they didn't know a lot about how big solar sort of structures itself, how it finances itself. So we decided that we would sort of come down the market and come closer to the communities that we're trying to serve by engaging with these helpers and co-developers. The blacks around the outside, those ovals, those are organizations that I invested in partnership with our environment team. Learned a lot from some of them, and from the CDFIs and the green banks, mostly learned that CDFIs were slow to come into the environment space, and green banks are mostly, are folks familiar with green banks? Have people talked to you about them before? There's only a handful of them in the country that have a balance sheet and have done much in the space. Most of them are like created after IRA by, they gave 50 grand and one staff person to some newly created entity in state X so that that state can and believes it can then participate in some of the greenhouse gas reduction funding that's coming down. But there's a handful of good ones. Connecticut Green Bank is one of the countries leading, for sure. So if you haven't had anyone from there talk to you yet, you should. But they're largely governmental entities, and because of that, they don't have a mandate to work in low-income communities. Their mandate isn't to address systemic racism in the communities of color and how it plays out in the environment or energy space. Their mandate is to raise everybody at the same time. So in order to get this system to work, we need this community development lenders to understand and adopt products that are focused on the transition to a cleaner future. We need green banks to understand the importance of investing in these communities and how you show up and work in those communities. So we, drilled down on these folks, the helpers and co-developers. The lack of deal flow is is identified as the big barrier. And so, there's so many conversations and convenings and tables about how the financing is going to flow from the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. But what I keep telling folks is that without a concerted effort on getting buildings ready in the communities you're targeting, the money just is not gonna land in these communities. When in 8 months, a year from now, when all these community development lenders have access to these new billions, which is like going to double everybody's balance sheets, and it's a massive amount of money for the space, they're going to be under a lot of pressure to move it. And if they come into the low-income community and that community is not ready, even though Justice 40 says 40% of the benefits has to flow to that community, well, they're going to reframe that. If they can't find projects in Justice 40 communities, they're going to put them in, they're going to flow that money to more affluent communities, and then you will hear about how Justice 40 has created all these jobs for low-income people to come to my rich neighborhood and install panels. And that without getting those buildings and those projects ready, the administration will not meet its goals. So we thought that, by investing in these helpers, in these co-developers, we can help them improve their business models. We can transfer lessons we've learned from investing in larger groups and try to make sure that more buildings are ready to receive the capital. I think I listed these are in the Inflation Reduction Act. There's gobs of things, rebates and support for technical assistance providers, all kinds of things in the bill related to solar. For my work, these top two things are the things that I focus on, where I see the biggest opportunity. So one of the things we help the co-developers do is to understand how corporations structure the work. The fact that you would have a parent company, that you would create a development company that people call a DevCo, where you develop the project, construct it, sign the lease with the entity, then later you sell the system from one side, from your development subsidiary to your project holding subsidiary. And in doing that, you can market at what the fair market value of that project is. So how do developers get paid for developing a system? Well, the finished system is worth more than how much the panels were and how much you paid the construction people and all the materials that went into it. As an operating system, it has a value that tends to be 10, 20% higher than the cost. And it was with the groups that we were working with, this wasn't their area of expertise. So just an example of the kind of technical assistance that we help provide to these developers working in space, and why they need people with MBAs and people with advanced degrees. And this would be on the business side, but there's other needs, certainly. This is a similar, this is the same schematic, but the boxes in green are the different types of investments that they need. One of the reasons to separate out the activities is to separate out the risk. So a construction loan is riskier than a back leverage loan on a loan to fill that financing gap between equity and tax credits. And lenders, if you have it all on one balance sheet, then your first lender is going to put a lien on everything. So we encourage them to set up these different project companies, these development companies, and then ourselves have invested. My playbook has been we identify one of these folks, we make a construction financing available to them with cash, a loan, and then we use unfunded guarantee capacity to draw in capital from the market for the for the asset holding side. And we also are working on credit enhancements to help spur the new ways to monetize the tax credits. So the sale of solar tax credits is a new activity to convince a bank that they should, or any investor, that they should buy credits from my community health centers who are trying to sell them. Well, they've never done it before. Neither side has. The legislation is new. There's a risk of recapture of that tax credit. The risk is extraordinarily low, but new investors don't understand that. And they're just coming into the space. They're not going to take my word for it. They want some experience. They want to show me the example of who has done it before. And so one of the ways we create in philanthropy those examples is by, reducing the risk, buying down the risk for investors by providing some credit enhancement. Anyway, I won't go through all the boxes, but there's several different types of capital that's needed at different stages and for different parts of the organization. So one of the greatest boons for the community development space with the Inflation Reduction Act is this thing called direct pay, where you can get that 30%, 40% tax credit refunded to a nonprofit's balance sheet. The environmental justice, are folks familiar with the environmental justice community? If I say that, yeah. So, we all owe them a debt of gratitude, and they certainly believe that they're kind of instrumental in the creation of the Inflation Reduction Act, of this administration's focus on it, and Justice 40, the sort of lifting up the disparate impact of our existing energy infrastructure on communities of color and low-income communities, and trying to have a solve for it. But then the environmental justice folks they tend to be they're advocates, they're organizers, they are not financiers, they are not solar installers, they're not developers. And to a lot of smart people, of course, and Kresge grant funds a whole ton of it. But now I am sometimes at odds with some folks in the community, because now direct pay, the way they see that, is like, well, now every church, every community serving group, every school, they can own the system themselves and they can get it back. They can get the credit back themselves through direct pay. And while that's true, I think it's not the right path for most nonprofits, most small businesses, most organizations in communities of color. A solar panel, a microgrid, is essentially a mini power station. And to commit to 20, 25 years of the operation and maintenance that's required for that is not the right choice for many, many groups. And so we're saying that we're out in the field telling people different things. Environmental justice community, I'd love to sort of harness the community to help put forward solutions that would actually get buildings ready. The Inflation Reduction, the parts of the Inflation Reduction Act that I'm referring to, they're aimed at buildings. They're not aimed at communities. They're not aimed at cross-sector tables. They're not aimed at like identifying huge infrastructure projects. It's resources for buildings. There's financing, there's tax credits. And the communities, the environmental justice folks care about, are going to miss out on this, like they've missed out on generations of progress, unless they get their buildings ready. And how do you get a building ready? One, you have to convince the owner of the building, whether it be a person or a committee or an organization, that they should trust the people talking to them, and they should assess their building and design a project, and that there's a benefit to them in that. Trying to go an extra step of convincing them that, and you should manage the mini power station for 25 years, it's creating barriers to getting to yes, and it's creating barriers to understanding what the true benefit of direct pay is. For me, what I think the huge boon of direct pay is that now nonprofit developers, nonprofit asset owners can directly monetize the credit, as opposed to each individual project doing it. Community solar, I got a couple little sidebar. How am I doing on time? Sorry, 7 more minutes? Okay. So these will be in the slides, in the deck. I hear the term, I was saying earlier, like getting a frame of reference for the size of a system took me some time to understand. Hearing how everybody uses the term community solar is taking me some time to understand. And I understand now it's not a very well-defined term. It means lots of things. It means people use it, I think, sometimes on purpose, being unclear about the meaning. Because, yeah, we're community solar. The Department of Energy has a massive community solar accelerator program. And so if you're interested in community solar, just sort of getting a little if you're talking to somebody about it, understanding what it is that they're talking about. At its most basic, it simply means a grid with lots of off-takers. There's nothing equitable, inherently equitable about it. And there are varying degrees of people who talk about whether it's an ownership model or not. This is, I think you probably understand this. We even said it earlier. Community solar is dependent on enabling legislation. You have to be allowed to connect to the grid. Utility has to be told or agree to buy power and issue credits. Varies wildly around the country. In Louisiana, New Orleans is one of our focus cities. There's this great project down there called Community Lighthouse, where they want no person who lives in New Orleans to be more than 15-minute walk from a resiliency center. So they have, unstable grid, and climate change is increasing the storms that knock their power out. Places where you can keep your medicine cold, plug your devices, seek shelter. Anyway, we had a recent policy win there where the issue in having community solar work in Louisiana was that the utility was only paying like, 20%, 10% of what it charged for electricity. So the rates that if selling power back to the grid doesn't mean you get full value for it. It varies greatly by state. And the states in blue here have legislation that is supportive or allows community solar. Most of the others essentially do not. So the thrust of my work, which is going to be the next few stages here, is we discovered capital wasn't the barrier to increasing access in low-income communities. What was? Well, one thing is just like kind of normalization of the technology. Like this is, I think it probably looks pretty bad there, but this is supposed to be a city, a couple rivers flowing through it. Think Pittsburgh or Chicago. Which divides, makes geographic divisions within the city. This lower area, this is where people of color are concentrated. This is where low-income people are concentrated. This is where we put the power plant and the dump and the highway runs through it. But what it lacks is penetration of solar panels or distributed battery storage or charging stations. It's a charging station desert. And I really believe in the sort of power normalization. So what happens today is some guy in a suit drops down into this community and says, hey, I got a great deal for you. Sign this 25-year lease. Don't worry about reading. It's really complicated. And you're going to have green power. And there's a huge trust barrier in a lot of these communities for good reason. In this country, we have, generation after generation, every new financial innovation has meant scams in low-income communities and communities of color. If you've ever looked into some of the history of the first banks that were set up for freed slaves or any new wave of immigrants, there's always stories of white people get put in charge of it, collect all the deposits, and they put all the paper records in a wooden building for the black folks, and then the building burns down, and now nobody has title to their, there's all sorts of insane stories like that. So similar thing is happening now. This isn't rocket science, but it is technology. It can be complicated. Some of the financial mechanisms used to finance it are complicated. Trying to increase penetration into low-income communities is often met with just this trust barrier. People will shut down. They will say, okay, thank you for the information. And when their kids are walking to school or when they're driving to work, they don't see panels. They don't see electric vehicle charging stations. They don't see the technology. So we're working on this approach where, well, this was, getting the buildings ready. I talked a lot about that. The Charge Partnership is an effort to engage with community health centers. There are 14,000 community health centers across the country. They're located in every low-income community. There's one over, there's a great one over in Fairhaven here that we're talking to. And so we've developed this partnership between, most of these community serving groups have national associations. So there's a National Association of Community Health Centers is our partner. They give us access to the network and some level of implied trust because we're being recommended by a group they trust. There's a financing group that focuses on health centers, and there's the solar developer. And so I think I have another map. Some states are easier to do solar than others. The electricity is really high. The state wants it. They're supportive. So with the network, we've started in the green states. We've got maybe 80, 90 in the pipeline of these community action or these community health centers. And it's getting a lot of attention. We're showing up at state level associations to present, at the national conferences, and HRSA, which is a department in, I think, the Health and Human Services of the federal government, that's a funder of community health centers, is now having debates about every year they have to put in an application. Now they want to put in lines about how are you addressing climate change? How are you getting backup solar and storage? It's met with such success that now we're looking at replicating that partnership for other kinds of community serving groups. Community action agencies, I don't know if folks are familiar with those. Both the health centers and community action agencies kind of came out of the war on poverty in the late 60s, and they are like the federal government's anti-poverty ecosystem, for lack of a better term. There's a community action agency that covers every square inch of the country. There's about 1,000 of these. So we have a solar developer focused on those kinds of groups, a partnership with the National Membership Organization, and as a way to try to get those entities to start to assess their buildings, get their projects, get their buildings ready. The Black Church is kind of this, there's 2 or 3 denominations that together are tens of thousands of represent tens of thousands of churches. And we have a solar developer that's focused on those entities, and there's a national membership organization for ones interested in sustainability, and down the line. And so the theory here is like, if you can get, there's a church here, there's a food bank, there's a YWCA all in this community, and if you can get those entities to start to decarbonize their buildings, normalize the technology, and then how to get the last step to the people who live in those communities and start to help them decarbonize their lives is through partnerships with groups that focus at the consumer level. So I'm supporting this group called the Clean Energy Credit Union that offers a range of consumer products, and then we'll want, come to the Community Action Agency for our ribbon cutting. Here's some information about how our system works. If you're interested in some of this in your own life, we have Clean Energy Credit Union for financing for a range of things. Posigen is a group active here. I think Ben Healy was here and spoke with you already. Oh, someone from Posigen is coming to speak with you as well. Posigen is a great group that kind of upended the standard solar model by focusing on low-income communities, reaching homeowners through community partnerships, and instead of underwriting, instead of going to big houses, create a bespoke system that fits your roof and approve your credit based on your credit score. They've upended that model. They send people out into lower income communities. They have like a small and a large system, very standardized approach to the system installation and design. And then they underwrite to energy savings. So your credit score doesn't matter. It was very hard for them to get any capital. They're kind of out of the woods now, but for years, their biggest obstacle was convincing the markets that they could be invested in because well, this model's working great. We go to big houses, they have high credit scores. We like that model. You're telling us you're going to, invest it. You're not even going to check credit scores. It made their corporate financing a huge challenge. It's also a group where I learned a lot of the corporate structuring from. Where I just leave you is back on this ecosystem. There's lots of different organizations involved in this. There's lots of opportunities to be helpful and to plug in. And please continue your education in this space. And I'm local. I'm happy to be a resource to folks. I live in Guilford. My job is in Detroit, so I'm out there quite a bit. But happy to take any questions. Yeah, thank you.
I think your next assignment is actually, we're having Posigen come. They wanted actually to do a field trip to one of their installations, but I was like, I sort of felt like the field has moved beyond just going to see a solar facility. And what's really unique for me about Posigen is they're running TV ads on energy justice. So one of your assignments is going to be to write a script for a TV ad, and they're going to judge it before they come, and we'll read a couple of them in class and stuff, just to give you really hands-on experience, like in the work itself. Because you're probably slightly more prepared to write a script for an ad than you are to install a solar panel yet. But you'll get to both of them, hopefully, in your careers. So with that, I'll let Julia muster a couple questions from online, and then we'll shut down the online portion in a couple minutes.
Okay. You mentioned earlier that the tax incentive structure to address desired outcomes is not ideal. Do you envision a renewable energy infrastructure future that no longer involves tax credits? And are tax credits necessary to make these projects possible?
No, I do not envision. I mean, I think that it's imperfect, but it works well with our capitalist system and our, the way our kind of economy is structured. So they're an integral part of making this work. What was the last part of that?
Are tax credits necessary to make these projects possible?
They certainly are today, for sure. I think without the tax incentives, it depends. If you go back to that, state of where, without the tax incentives, Hawaii, Alaska, California, maybe a couple states up in this area of the country, electricity is expensive enough that you can still put panels up and save money. Storage, no. The Connecticut has a great program for storage with the utility. Where are folks familiar with peaker plants? Yeah, so to avoid a peaker plant is basically usually coal fired, and they build it in order to meet peak demand of energy. I was talking before about energy draw versus or power generation versus energy draw. At the peak times of the day, everyone is pulling a ton from the grid, and they have to have backup plants that they can fire up to meet demand. Well, in the Connecticut, they're trying to avoid building another one by having a huge network of distributed storage around the state. So they'll basically give you or your project a battery for free. They use it to charge and draw from daily, charge when demand's low, pull from it when demand's high. But if a storm's coming, they will charge your battery up and not draw from it, so that the owner of the system gets the resiliency benefit. Do I see the market eventually moving to a point where tax credits are not needed? Absolutely. I mean, I like to you hear all you hear from certain corners how bad EVs are going, the sale of EVs and getting people to buy them. But if you plot out the sales of EV, you've never seen a steeper J curve. It is off the charts. When this cars were first invented, I'm sure there were lots of articles about the demise of cars and how, there are all kinds of crazy rules. You had to dismantle your car if the horse was too scared to go past you. And I feel like we're in a kind of a time like that today, where now it's like fossil fuels is how we get the majority of our power. That's not going to change any in the very near future, but we are definitely on a path toward a more electric future and a less need to burn, to have little fires everywhere to create energy. How long does that take? How long does the government have to subsidize that transition? I'm not sure, but I certainly see the end of it.
Just, I don't know, quick follow-up. Is there any research on the inefficiency of tax credits? Can you tell us roughly, given that we're using this capitalist system, and the incentives of that, how much more efficient would it be to have direct transfers, and then the balance, of course, with the quote unquote profit incentive, I guess if it wasn't a direct investment incentive, there's the risk of lower performance potentially, right? So just what are your thoughts on those two dimensions?
I'm not aware of, there probably is some, not aware of research against it. Mostly the people who are benefiting from it, they don't want to knock it too hard because it's very helpful. But it's not a direct benefit to the university or to the community health center in town. They have to get a market actor who's going to benefit from it, and it makes it less efficient for sure. But I'm very thankful for these tax credit programs. And I also am a believer that individual greed is maybe not the best word to use, but greed has been an amazing boon to innovation. And if you do with an absent sort of profit motive, it's anyway, it's probably not the right class for that argument, but but it does work. It has its downsides, and there's a safety net is needed, and there's a way to ensure people a fair and equity across the system. But the tax credits are in place to motivate profit-seeking investors to come into the space, and largely it works.
Regarding your comment about low to moderate income communities not owning generation resources, could these communities hire a company to operate and maintain their systems? And would managing these resources make owning the project too costly for these groups?
So I missed the second part. Given the comments about them not owning systems.
Can these communities hire a company to operate and maintain their systems?
Well, yes. I mean, and still own them. So if the question is, could they still own them and outsource the operating and management? Absolutely. And with the community, with the charge partnership, community health centers are about the strongest as a class of community serving organizations. They're about the strongest group out there. There's solid balance sheets. When there's recession or disaster strikes, the federal government and states tend to put more resources into those organizations, whereas other community serving groups starve during those times. There's this great pharmacy program for Medicaid serving health centers that is a huge revenue generator for a lot of them. So as a class, they're very strong. And about half of those community health centers that Charge Partnership is working with are choosing to purchase the system themselves. And then they have to have a way to deal with the operation and management. There are third parties that they could outsource that to. But in my view and my experience, for most community serving organizations, that decision is much harder. Their balance sheets aren't as strong. They tend not to have the same level of professionalism on their staff. And the community health centers are staffed by doctors and people who've spent a lot of time in, getting strong educations. And not to knock, I'm sometimes careful about the language because it sounds critical of the other groups, but they're just, this capacity isn't the same. Their balance sheets aren't the same. And to take on a decision to own and be responsible for the maintenance of a mini power station for decades, it's a harder decision to make. And for most of the groups, I would argue it's not the right decision for them when there's an easier pathway to achieving the same result. I'm all for local ownership of the commercial district in a low-income community, the ownership of the buildings themselves, ownership of the means of production, ownership of the housing, the buildings, the small businesses. But that's a difficult goal, and that's something that Kresge and others are certainly working on. The environmental justice community, I think, has grabbed onto the ownership. And so we will own the systems. And I think it's a little misguided with that advice.
With that, thank you, Joe. We're going to go offline and just engage with the classroom directly. Thanks to all of our online participants. Next week is, who's the speaker again? Anyway, stay tuned. We switched it up, so I'm kind of like trying to remember. Anyway, thanks everyone. Check online for our next week's speaker, and we'll see you next week. Thanks.